The year was 1941. The Second World War was already in full swing, and Britain found itself on the brink of collapse. The Luftwaffe's relentless bombing campaign had reduced cities like London to rubble. Yet, despite the bombs falling from the skies, Britain remained resolute, led by a man who would become synonymous with defiance and triumph, Winston Churchill. While Churchill was already rallying the nation with his impassioned speeches, a less public, more secretive document was being drafted in the darkened corridors of power, one that would forever change the course of the war and the future of the Allied strategy. In the early days of the war, Churchill understood that Britain's survival depended on securing critical supplies and winning the battle for the seas. With the collapse of France in 1940, Britain stood alone against the German war machine. But in the midst of daily crises, Churchill's mind turned toward the future. He was convinced that, while Britain could not defeat Germany alone, an alliance with the United States would prove pivotal. Yet, to make that alliance work, he needed more than just political support. He needed strategy. He needed a plan that could bring the full force of American industrial power into the war while ensuring that Britain would not be left behind in the post-war world order. Thus, in a moment of brilliant foresight, Churchill penned a memo in the summer of 1941, a document so secret it would not be fully revealed until after the war. The memo outlined a radical shift in Allied strategy that would directly confront Hitler's military might and lay the groundwork for a more cohesive, unified war effort. This document, referred to as Churchill's secret memo, would have profound implications not only for military strategy but for the future of the world. At the time, there were those within the British government who believed that the only way to defeat Nazi Germany was through a massive invasion of Europe. The idea of a cross-channel invasion, however, was an audacious and risky plan that could result in disastrous losses. But Churchill's memo took a different approach. It proposed an alternative strategy, one focused on weakening Germany's industrial base through strategic bombing, targeting key infrastructure, and creating economic havoc. At the same time, it called for bolstering the British Navy and Air Force to protect vital sea lanes and resources. But most importantly, it recognized the necessity of aligning Britain's strategy with that of the United States. The implications of this memo were immense. It meant that Britain would take on a secondary, supporting role in many of the larger battles to come. It also meant Churchill would have to convince Franklin D. Roosevelt that an American military presence on European soil was crucial, even before the United States had officially entered the war. The gravity of this memo cannot be overstated. It shaped the Allied war strategy in a way that aligned their objectives and, for the first time, allowed Britain and America to fight as a truly unified force against a common enemy. But while this document would eventually lead to victory, it also marked the beginning of a series of events that would shape the post-war world in ways Churchill could scarcely imagine. His commitment to the Anglo-American alliance would later be tested by the dawning Cold War, and his ideas on the post-war order would clash with the realities of the new global power structures that emerged after the Axis defeat. The memo, once a secret weapon in the war effort, would ultimately become a symbol of the shifting tides of power. In the years to come, when historians would study the war, this memo would be acknowledged as the document that crystallized the turning point for the Allies. It was a moment of clarity in a war full of chaos and uncertainty, and it would resonate far beyond the battlefield. But in 1941 it was just another of Churchill's many strategic moves, one that would change the future of warfare, geopolitics, and history itself. As Britain faced the threat of Nazi Germany's domination over Europe, Churchill's strategic vision evolved. The war was far from over, and yet the outcomes were already beginning to take shape in the minds of the war leaders. By the time the United States entered the conflict in 1941, Britain had already begun to shift its military strategy. The implications of Churchill's secret memo were slowly taking root, influencing not only the conduct of the war but also the nature of the global alliances that would emerge. The strategy outlined in the memo was grounded in realism. Churchill knew that Britain alone could not defeat Germany. It required more than sheer willpower or a show of resolve. It required an intricate balance of military might, industrial power, and alliances that could create a coordinated front against the Axis powers. The United States, with its massive industrial output and technological expertise, was the key to this strategy. But Roosevelt's reluctance to engage in the European war made it clear that a subtle, persuasive approach would be needed. The momentous decision for an Atlantic partnership was forged not through grand declarations but through quiet negotiations and calculated moves. Churchill worked tirelessly to cultivate Roosevelt's trust, gradually drawing him into the fold. He knew that in order to secure America's involvement in the European theater, he would need to prove that an Allied victory was not just a matter of beating Germany militarily but of ensuring a post-war world order that would serve the interests of democracy and peace. This vision would set the stage for future cooperation between the US and Britain, which would have far-reaching consequences. In 1942, with the secret Memo's influence beginning to take hold, the Allies' first major joint operation, Operation Torch, was launched. The success of this North African campaign helped solidify the partnership between Britain and the United States. It was the first major deployment of American forces in Europe, and it marked a pivotal moment in the war. However, it also highlighted the tensions and disagreements that would continue to exist between the two nations. Churchill, committed to maintaining Britain's dominance within the alliance, sought to ensure that British interests were not overshadowed by America's growing influence. The North African campaign was a critical step in the Allies' progress, but it also revealed the cracks in the relationship between the two powers. As the Allies pushed further into Europe, differing views on strategy and the post-war order began to surface. Churchill's secret memo had set the stage for a unified effort, but it also foreshadowed the deepening divide between Britain and the United States, particularly as the Cold War began to take shape. With the invasion of Normandy in 1944, the Allies had established a foothold in Europe, and the end of the war was in sight. Yet, despite the victories on the battlefield, Churchill's position was becoming increasingly precarious. The British public, exhausted by years of war, demanded change. The promise of post-war reconstruction and a better future was now more urgent than ever. As the tide of battle turned in the Allies' favor, Churchill's vision for Britain's role in the post-war world would soon be tested in ways he had not anticipated. The defeat at the polls in 1945 came as a shock to Churchill. Victory in the war was supposed to have secured his place in history, yet the British electorate turned its back on him in the midst of his greatest triumph. The results of the general election revealed a nation yearning for change, for something more than just victory in the war. The public, exhausted by years of hardship, looked to the future and saw a need for radical reforms in education, housing, and healthcare. The Labour Party, under Clement Attlee, won a landslide victory, and Churchill's once unshakable grip on power evaporated. In the aftermath of the election, Churchill retreated to his country estate at Chartwell, where he found himself grappling with the consequences of his political defeat. The same public that had hailed him as a hero during the war now turned away, seeking a new direction in the aftermath of the destruction. The very people who had once relied on his leadership now demanded more than speeches and military victories. They wanted the promises of a better life, a fairer society, and a brighter future. For Churchill, the loss was more than just a political setback. It was a personal blow to his sense of destiny. Having led Britain to victory, he believed that he had earned the right to shape the post-war world. But the result of the election forced him to confront a painful truth, that the world he had fought to preserve had already changed, and that the political landscape was shifting beneath his feet. The people who had once stood by him were now turning to new ideas, to a new vision of what Britain could become. But even in defeat, Churchill remained a man of immense influence. He understood that the struggle for Britain's future was not over, and he was determined to remain a central figure in shaping the direction of the nation. He may have lost the election, but his role in the Allied victory in the war had cemented his place in history. As the nation embarked on a new era, Churchill knew that his legacy was not defined by electoral politics, but by the decisions that had shaped the course of the war and the fate of the free world. In the years that followed, Churchill would remain active in public life, continuing to speak out on the issues that mattered most to him. His vision of a united Europe, of a world where the forces of democracy could hold back the tide of totalitarianism, would continue to shape his actions. Even as he lost political power, his voice would remain a guiding force in the shaping of the post-war world. As the Cold War intensified and the geopolitical landscape shifted, Churchill's secret memo, and the strategy it outlined, became an enduring symbol of his foresight and understanding of global power dynamics. The partnership between Britain and the United States, forged through careful diplomacy and military collaboration, would lay the foundation for the Western alliance during the Cold War. However, Churchill's vision of Anglo-American unity would not come without its challenges. The post-war world order that Churchill had envisioned was never fully realized. Despite his pivotal role in defeating Nazi Germany, the rise of the Soviet Union and the growing tensions between East and West would soon overshadow his dreams of a unified Europe. Churchill had hoped that the defeat of Hitler would mark the beginning of a new era of peace and cooperation, but the reality of the Cold War quickly dashed those hopes. The very strategy outlined in his secret memo, which had been so instrumental in winning the war, became a point of contention in the years that followed. In his later years, Churchill would reflect on his legacy and the decisions that had shaped the course of history. He often expressed regret that he had not done more to address the issues of post-war reconstruction during the immediate aftermath of the conflict. While his military strategy had been instrumental in securing victory, he recognized that the challenges of rebuilding a war-torn world required more than just military might. It required a vision for peace, prosperity, and social justice that extended beyond the battlefield. Despite these regrets, Churchill's legacy remained intact. His role in securing the Allied victory in the Second World War and his ability to inspire a nation in its darkest hours ensured that he would never be forgotten. Even in defeat, he had maintained his place as one of the towering figures of the 20th century. The secret memo, once a quiet, confidential document, had become a symbol of Churchill's enduring influence on the world stage, a testament to his foresight and determination in the face of unimaginable odds. As Churchill grappled with the realities of post-war Britain, the secret memo that had steered Allied strategy began to reveal its deeper implications. The coordination between Britain and the United States, facilitated by the memo, set the stage for the Western alliance that would form the backbone of Cold War geopolitics. But the forces unleashed by this collaboration were not entirely within Churchill's control. The memo had been a reflection of his deep understanding of both the war and the emerging post-war order. Yet even he could not foresee how these changes would unfold. Churchill's strategy had sought to avoid direct confrontation with the Soviet Union, but as the war drew to a close, the lines of division in Europe became clearer. While the Axis powers were defeated, a new ideological battle loomed between the capitalist West, led by the United States and Britain, and the communist East, under the control of Joseph Stalin. The Western powers, despite their shared wartime victory, found themselves unable to reconcile their differences in how Europe should be reconstructed. Despite his early cooperation with Roosevelt, Churchill's post-war vision was in stark contrast to that of Stalin. The secret memo's focus on American involvement had been crucial, but as Britain found itself caught between two superpowers, the diplomatic dance to maintain that balance became an ever more precarious one. Stalin's expansionist ambitions in Eastern Europe, coupled with his refusal to allow free elections in countries like Poland, led Churchill to recognize that the promised post-war peace was beginning to dissolve. Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946, delivered in Fulton, Missouri, crystallized the deepening divide between East and West. While the speech was designed to warn the world of the growing Soviet threat, it was also a pointed reminder of the delicate line Churchill had to walk. He had relied on American military and economic support during the war, and he now hoped that the United States would play a similar role in the face of the Soviet challenge. The implications of this speech were profound. It set the stage for the Cold War and marked Churchill's transition from wartime hero to Cold War statesman, advocating for a united front against the Soviet menace. Yet Churchill's experience with the secret memo showed him that history moved faster than any man could control. As the geopolitical landscape shifted, Britain's diminished power became painfully apparent. Churchill had navigated Britain through its darkest days, but now the tide of history was flowing toward a new world order, one where British influence was no longer the dominant force. While America and the Soviet Union emerged as the two superpowers, Britain found itself relegated to the sidelines, its empire dissolving and its resources stretched thin. Churchill was no longer the commanding leader of a vast empire. Instead, he was a voice crying for unity in a fractured world. In private moments, Churchill would reflect on the consequences of his secret memo. Had he done enough to ensure Britain's place in the new world order? The partnership with the United States, while vital to winning the war, would ultimately become a bittersweet reminder of how far Britain had fallen. The British Empire, the very force he had spent much of his life defending, was giving way to the realities of post-war decolonization. Yet, for all the melancholy of these reflections, Churchill remained steadfast in his belief that the fight against totalitarianism was the most important cause of all. His legacy, he hoped, would not be measured by the decline of empire, but by the victory over tyranny. Churchill's political defeat in 1945, after leading Britain through the Second World War, was a wound that refused to heal. The public, once so loyal to him during the war, had turned toward a different vision. One focused not on military triumph but on social welfare, rebuilding the shattered nation. The Labour Party's victory, led by Clement Attlee, signaled the dawn of a new era, one that saw the birth of the National Health Service, nationalization of key industries, and a welfare state designed to provide for every citizen from the cradle to the grave. For Churchill, the defeat was not just electoral, it was deeply personal. Despite his unmatched contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany, the people of Britain no longer saw him as the man to guide them into peace. The world he had fought to preserve was now shifting under his feet. While Churchill had secured victory, the British public, tired of war and desperate for the comforts of peace, sought change, a new kind of leadership. They wanted a future built on equality and opportunity, not a leader fixated on the glories of past triumphs. But even as he faced the sting of defeat, Churchill remained a towering figure on the world stage. His voice, now an echo of wartime defiance, still resonated in the halls of power. As the world entered the post-war period, the geopolitical implications of Churchill's earlier strategies began to unfold in ways he had not anticipated. The Atlantic alliance he had worked so tirelessly to forge was now tested by new divisions: the rise of the Soviet Union, the decolonization of Africa and Asia, and the dawn of the Cold War. Churchill, though no longer in power, would remain a key player in these events, his strategy still influencing the unfolding drama of the 20th century. In his retreat to Chartwell, Churchill often reflected on his legacy. He wrote letters, painted, and engaged in lengthy discussions with visitors, but there was a lingering sadness. Despite his wartime glory, he felt his contributions to post-war Britain were overlooked. He had championed a vision of Anglo-American unity, but in the face of Soviet expansion and the rise of the United States as the world's dominant superpower, his vision seemed increasingly out of step with the realities of the New World Order. Churchill's sense of history and destiny made it difficult for him to accept that the world had moved on. But even in his political exile, he never gave up the fight for what he believed was right. He continued to speak out, warning of the dangers of appeasement and advocating for a strong, united Western alliance. His speeches, once the lifeblood of British morale, now became calls for unity in a world increasingly divided. Despite his political defeat, Churchill's influence was far from over. In 1946, he delivered his now famous Iron Curtain speech, warning the world of the growing Soviet threat. The speech, delivered in Fulton, Missouri, marked the beginning of a new phase in Churchill's career, one where his focus shifted from national leadership to global strategy. As the world teetered on the brink of the Cold War, Churchill's voice became one of the few advocating for unity in the face of the Soviet menace. The Iron Curtain speech was a call to arms, not for military intervention, but for ideological unity. Churchill knew that the future of Europe depended on the ability of the Western powers to stand firm against Soviet expansion. While the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies during the war, Churchill saw the writing on the wall. The Soviet Union's intentions in Eastern Europe were clear. They sought to impose their ideology on the continent, and Britain, along with the United States, could not afford to ignore this new threat. The speech was a rallying cry, but it also marked a turning point in Churchill's relationship with the United States. As the Cold War began to take shape, Churchill understood that the United States was now the most powerful nation on Earth. He had long championed the special relationship between Britain and America, but as the two nations grappled with the realities of the post-war world, Churchill found himself in the role of an elder statesman, advocating for policies that were increasingly shaped by American interests. The speech and the years that followed cemented Churchill's place as a key figure in the early Cold War. His warnings about Soviet expansion were prescient, but they also highlighted the complexities of the world in which Britain now found itself. The United States was the dominant force in global affairs, and Britain had to navigate its role in this new world order carefully. Churchill's shift to Cold War diplomacy marked the beginning of his second political life. No longer the man who had led Britain to victory in the war, he was now the man who sought to ensure the survival of Western democracy in the face of Soviet totalitarianism. It was a role that brought him both respect and frustration, as the world he had once shaped began to change in ways he had not foreseen. In 1951, Churchill made a remarkable return to power. After 6 years of political exile, he was once again named Prime Minister, this time leading a conservative government in a country still reeling from the effects of the war. The nation had undergone profound changes in his absence, but Churchill's return was seen as a stabilizing force, a reassurance to the British people that the man who had led them through their darkest hours was back at the helm. Churchill's second premiership was not defined by military triumph, but by the challenges of leading a post-war nation. The British Empire was crumbling, rationing persisted, and the Cold War was intensifying. Despite these challenges, Churchill's leadership style remained rooted in his wartime ethos, resolute, defiant, and determined. His speeches, though less fiery than in his earlier years, still carried weight, and he worked tirelessly to navigate Britain's position in the New World Order. Yet Churchill's return to power was not without its difficulties. His health, weakened by years of stress and age, began to deteriorate. Despite this, he remained committed to the task at hand, focusing on foreign policy and the defense of the Western world. His efforts to maintain Britain's influence on the global stage were complicated by the rise of the United States as the dominant superpower, but Churchill's deep understanding of history and diplomacy kept him relevant in the changing geopolitical landscape. The Cold War and the growing tension between the West and the Soviet Union became central to Churchill's second premiership. He advocated for a united front against the communist threat, while also recognizing the need for cooperation with the United States. Churchill's leadership during this time was defined less by military action and more by his ability to shape the discourse surrounding the Cold War. By the mid-1950s, Churchill's health had begun to fail him. His hands trembled, his speech became slurred, and his once vibrant energy seemed to diminish with each passing day. Despite this, Churchill remained deeply involved in the affairs of state, continuing to offer advice and guidance to his colleagues. His influence, though diminished, was still felt on both sides of the Atlantic. It was during this time that Churchill began to reflect more deeply on his legacy. Having led Britain through the darkest days of the war, and having played a central role in shaping the post-war world, he had seen his country change in ways that had once seemed unimaginable. The British Empire, the very institution he had spent much of his life defending, was rapidly fading. But despite these changes, Churchill remained steadfast in his belief that Britain still had an important role to play in the world. His final years were marked by a sense of resignation, but also by moments of profound clarity. Churchill's health may have been failing, but his mind remained sharp, and he continued to write, reflect, and offer counsel. He had always believed in the power of history to shape the future, and he saw his own place in that narrative as one of resilience, perseverance, and determination. In January 1965, Winston Churchill passed away at the age of 90. The world he had helped shape, the world that had been on the brink of destruction during the Second World War, had changed in ways that he could never have fully anticipated. Yet, despite the passing of time, Churchill's legacy remained firmly entrenched in the hearts and minds of the British people and the world at large. His funeral, held in St. Paul's Cathedral, was attended by world leaders, dignitaries, and millions of people who had been touched by his leadership. The man who had once rallied a nation on the brink of collapse was now being remembered as a symbol of courage, defiance, and perseverance. As his coffin was carried through the streets of London, the city, and the world paid tribute to the man who had helped save civilization during its darkest hour. Churchill's life was a testament to the power of leadership in times of crisis. His strategic foresight, his unyielding will to win, and his deep understanding of history helped shape the 20th century in ways few leaders could ever hope to match. Even in death, Churchill's voice continued to echo across the globe, a reminder of the man who had stood alone against tyranny and led Britain to victory. As the 1960s unfolded, Winston Churchill became a living legend, an elder statesman revered around the world but increasingly distant from the day-to-day affairs of government. His years of service, his wartime triumphs, and his unrelenting spirit had made him an icon, but in the quiet of his later years, he was increasingly isolated. The Britain that had once revered him was changing rapidly, and his era was fading away. At Chartwell, his country home, Churchill spent his days quietly, often painting or reading. The world had moved on and he could feel the pace of change in his bones. The empire he had spent his life defending was dissolving, and the United States, once a distant ally, was now the undisputed superpower. Churchill's role in this new world was uncertain, and though he continued to influence global events through speeches and writing, his health was deteriorating. The vigor that had once propelled him through the darkest hours of war was now giving way to the limitations of age. Yet even as he struggled with the physical effects of aging, Churchill's mind remained sharp. He had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the brutal clash of ideologies, and the sweeping tides of history. But now, his reflections were tinged with a melancholy for the passing of an era. The empire that had been his life's work was no more, and he knew that his political influence had waned. Still, there was something about him that drew people in. His name alone still commanded respect, and when he spoke, the world listened, even if he was no longer the man who had shaped its destiny. Churchill's ghostly presence in British politics was more than just a relic of the past. He was a reminder of what had been, a symbol of perseverance and resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. But as the new generation of politicians took the stage, Churchill found himself increasingly sidelined. He was no longer the voice of the nation's future. He was a figure to be admired but not necessarily followed. Despite the decline of his political power, Churchill's speeches and writings still carried weight, and his vision of a united Western front against totalitarianism resonated in the midst of the Cold War. In his final years, Churchill spent more time reflecting on his legacy, contemplating the long road he had traveled. He often said that he had lived a life of destiny, one shaped by the great events of history. But the truth was more complex. He had fought, sacrificed, and led Britain through the darkest hours, but he had also been forced to confront the changing realities of a post-imperial world. Despite his towering achievements, there was a quiet sadness that accompanied his reflections, the recognition that the world he had fought to preserve was no longer his to shape. In his solitude, Churchill's greatest legacy remained his words. His speeches, rousing, defiant, and full of conviction, continued to echo across time, reminding the world of a moment when Britain stood alone against tyranny. And though the man himself was fading, his words carried on, speaking to new generations about the power of courage, conviction, and leadership in the face of darkness. As the years passed and Churchill's health continued to decline, the question of his legacy became ever more pressing. He had led Britain through the most harrowing war in its history, yet the nature of his legacy, and how it would be remembered, became a source of reflection for both him and those who had worked with him. His career had spanned an era of unprecedented change, and in his final years Churchill came to terms with the fact that history would judge him, not just for his successes but for his failures as well. Churchill often spoke about the importance of history, not just in terms of his own place in it, but in the broader sweep of human events. He had always been conscious of the power of legacy and how it could shape the future. Yet, as he faced the twilight of his life, he found that the weight of history was not always as he had imagined. He had achieved greatness in war, but the post-war world was a different arena, one where his old certainties about empire and Britain's place in the world no longer held sway. The Britain of the 1960s was no longer the Britain he had known. The empire was gone, and the country was grappling with its own identity in a rapidly changing world. The Cold War was now the dominant global conflict, and the issues that concerned Churchill in his later years were no longer centered on military victory, but on the survival of democracy in a world threatened by nuclear war and ideological divides. Despite these shifts, Churchill never stopped believing in the values that had guided him throughout his life: freedom, democracy, and the defense of civilization. Even in his final speeches and writings, he continued to advocate for a strong, united West, one that could stand against the growing threat of totalitarianism. His vision of an Atlantic alliance between Britain and the United States remained a cornerstone of his foreign policy thinking, and even as his health failed, he remained a tireless advocate for this cause. However, the world had moved on. Churchill's role as the leader of Britain and the Western world had passed, and in his final years, he found himself more of a spectator than an actor in the drama of history. Yet, despite this, he remained a symbol, a living monument to the power of leadership in times of crisis. His legacy, for all its contradictions, was secure. He had saved Britain in its darkest hour, and in doing so, had ensured that the values of freedom and democracy would continue to resonate long after the war had ended. As he prepared for his final departure, Churchill was aware that history would not treat him with unqualified admiration. He had made mistakes, and there were those who would criticize his policies and decisions. But in his final days, Churchill seemed at peace with the judgment of history. He had played his part in shaping the world, and he knew that, in the end, it was not the victories or defeats that mattered most, but the courage to face the challenges of history head-on. By the time Churchill reached his 90th year, his physical decline was undeniable. His days were now spent in a quiet retreat, away from the bustle of politics and the demands of leadership. Yet even in his twilight years, the spirit that had driven him throughout his life remained intact. He had faced down the greatest dangers of his time, and now, in the quiet of his final years, he faced the greatest challenge of all, the challenge of accepting the passing of time. In these later years, Churchill was less active in the public eye, though his legacy remained a topic of fascination. Visitors to Chartwell were struck by the contrast between the vibrant leader of the past and the frail, aging man they now encountered. Yet even in his decline, Churchill's presence was powerful. He would speak of the past, of the war, of the empire, of the world he had fought to preserve, with the same conviction that had marked his speeches during the darkest days of the conflict. Despite his health, Churchill was never content to simply rest. His mind remained sharp, and he continued to write and speak on matters of great importance. He had always believed in the power of words, and he saw his writing as an essential part of his legacy. Whether reflecting on his war years, the state of the world, or the lessons of history, Churchill's words carried the weight of his experience and his vision for the future. Yet, as the years passed, there was a sense of inevitability to Churchill's life, a recognition that the world had changed in ways he could no longer control. The British Empire had crumbled, and Britain was no longer the dominant force in the world. The United States had emerged as the new superpower, and the Soviet Union had become the primary adversary. Churchill had always believed in the importance of a strong, united West, but the realities of the post-war world made his vision increasingly difficult to realize. As Churchill's health continued to deteriorate, the realization that his time was running out became more pronounced. He knew that his days were numbered, but even in his final years, he remained a man of extraordinary resolve. He had faced down the forces of tyranny, and now he would face the inevitable with the same courage that had defined his life. In January 1965, Winston Churchill passed away at the age of 90. His death marked the end of an era, the end of a life that had been shaped by some of the most momentous events of the 20th century. For Britain and the world, Churchill had been a constant presence, a symbol of defiance and resilience in the face of unimaginable odds. His passing was a moment of profound significance, and it was met with an outpouring of grief and respect. Churchill's funeral was a grand and solemn affair, attended by dignitaries and world leaders from across the globe. The streets of London were lined with mourners, and the city seemed to come to a standstill as the nation bade farewell to one of its greatest sons. The funeral procession was a fitting tribute to a man who had led Britain through its darkest days and helped shape the course of world history. His coffin, draped in the Union Jack, was carried through the streets, and the nation paused to remember the man who had once spoken with such authority, such conviction, in defense of freedom. As his coffin was lowered into the ground, the world seemed to hold its breath. The man who had once been the voice of defiance was now gone. But Churchill's legacy would live on. His words, his courage, and his leadership would continue to inspire generations to come. In the years that followed, Britain would remember Churchill not just as a politician or a statesman, but as a symbol of the strength and resilience of the human spirit. Though Churchill was gone, the ideals he championed, the defense of liberty, democracy, and freedom, would remain. His memory would continue to resonate across the world, as a reminder of the power of leadership in times of crisis. For in the end, Churchill had not just shaped the course of history, he had defined it. Winston Churchill's place in history is secure. Historians have debated his legacy for decades, but one thing is clear: he was one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. His courage, his vision, and his unwavering commitment to defeating tyranny marked him as a figure of unparalleled significance. His leadership during the Second World War was nothing short of heroic, and his ability to inspire a nation in its darkest hour remains a defining moment in British history. Yet, like all great men, Churchill was not without his flaws. His political decisions were sometimes controversial, and his stubbornness and imperious nature often led to conflicts with his peers. His views on empire and race, for example, have been the subject of intense scrutiny in recent years. But these flaws do not diminish his achievements. Churchill was a man of his time, shaped by the circumstances in which he lived, and his vision of the world was one that transcended his personal shortcomings. In the end, Churchill's legacy is not just about the victories he secured or the battles he won. It is about his unwavering belief in the cause of freedom and his ability to inspire others to fight for that cause. His place in history is assured, not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to stand alone against the forces of evil when the world needed him most. Churchill's judgment, as he himself predicted, has been kind. Time has recognized him as a man who faced history's greatest challenges with courage and resolve. His legacy endures, not just in the monuments that bear his name, but in the values of liberty, democracy, and determination that continue to guide the world he helped shape. The torch he carried still burns brightly, a reminder of the man who never surrendered, and the world that stood with him.